Hello friends, welcome to digital learning platform of Department of Collegiate Education, Karnataka LMS. Today in this video we are going to take up the discussion of William Shakespeare's As You Like It, a critical appreciation of comic situations. So far as in our discussion we came to know that As You Like It is a romantic comedy with the theme of love. We see it's a comedy with complexity and conflict and complexity of conflict and the resolution of conflict, the conflict created in the process of love between the characters. Then we see that it's a pastoral comedy because it deals with the shepherds and the rustic life in the forest of Arden. We see the entry of different shepherds, a number of shepherds in the story, including Silvius or Corin, such that even the main characters, Rosalind and Celia, settles down as shepherds. That's why the story is a pastoral comedy. And it also has a touchstone in Jacques, the first comic, the finest comic creations created by Shakespeare in the play. We also have the process of a comedy in the play that it opens with introducing a conflict, and the conflict becomes complicated as the plot grows, and finally the complications of the plot are resoluted or solved by some magical shift or transformation, and a happy ending or denouement is the final end of the play. Thus the play is a comedy, as we have seen in the earlier discussions made in earlier videos. We move on to the today's concept, that the critical appreciation of comic situations in the play. When we come to the first act, Act 1, we see the act opens with some sad notes because it introduces the banishment of Duke Senior and usurped the Duke Ferdinand usurping the throne of the France. And again we also find enmity or hatredness between Orlando and Oliver, the ill treatment of Adam by Oliver, all these things introduces sad notes, but that sad note is taken here in order to contrast it with the comic situations which are going to be introduced. This is one of the techniques used by many writers. In fact, in the discussion of Arnold's Dover Beach, or even in his the scholar Gypsy, we find in a poem itself the same technique is used. The poem Dover Beach, for example, opens with the description of the beauty of the beach, but it later on introduces the critical situation. Thus, we find in this story, it opens with a kind of sad note, as a vice versa, and then it contrasts with the comic aspects of the play. That is in order to highlight the comedy or comic situations in the play. And we notice comedy through wit and humor and irony. This is another interesting thing in Shakespeare's comedies, that he uses wit, humor, and irony in order to create comic situations. One can understand his comedy only if he or she is able to understand the wit or humor there or irony there. For example, we have one instance where Oliver calls Orlando as low-born one and a villain. In the fight between the two brothers, Orlando and Oliver, Oliver addresses Orlando as he is low-born one and a villain. The usage low-born one probably has another significance, that Orlando is younger to Oliver, but on the other hand, that is not actually that, but he is instructing, he's blaming Orlando as he is inferior in birth. He doesn't have equivalent right and quality to Oliver. His ill treatment is evident here, but it is a sad note true. But his expression of, or his calling of Orlando as villain and low-born one, through his filthy language or bad language, makes himself appear as low-born one and a villain. This is irony here in the context. But the usage is also wit, because you see, low-born one and a villain is expressed by a villain who is appearing to be a low-born one. Thus, Shakespeare uses his wit and humor and irony to create that comedy. Again, we see Oliver's approval of the noble character in Orlando while disclosing the reason to hate him. Yeah, he has certain reasons to hate Orlando, but what reasons he claimed there are actually appreciation for Orlando's character. He is jealous of the good qualities, or good nature of Orlando. In the meanwhile, we therefore observe, while appreciating good qualities of Orlando, he makes an approval of it. The comedy again arises in Oliver's approval of the noble character in Orlando while disclosing the reasons to hate him. He's actually jealous of Orlando, and therefore he hates him. All the good qualities in Orlando, his valor, for example, his ability to um, fight, all these things actually made Oliver jealous of Orlando. Thus, we find in his hatred itself, he approves Orlando is stronger than him in morality, in deeds, in action. Thus, the first act introduces some aspects which creates comedy, or the humor through the usage of irony and wit. Again, in the same act, we have another sentence where Celia makes an immature thought of the return of throne after her father's death. She says she is the only daughter, and then she makes a point that she is not happy. We see Celia is the daughter of Duke Ferdinand, but she is against her father and she is favoring Duke Senior. She says, "You know, my father had no child, but I nor none is like to have. And truly, when he dies, thou shalt be his heir, for what he had taken away from thy father perforce." In her friendship, she assures her friend, her in her relationship, Rosalind, that after her father's death, and it is Rosalind's father who would inherit, or who would again get it, or she would get it, right? Rosalind will inherit it. Thus, she expects her father's death in order to resolute the situation. Thus, we find an immature thought of Celia, who is a daughter of Duke Ferdinand, expecting her father's death to provide justice to the situation. Then Orlando defeats Charles in the fight. We find that the Orlando's bravery, he fought well and all that. But at the end, it is very comic that he was overthrown by Rosalind's love. He surrenders himself to Rosalind's love. When Rosalind gives him the chain as present, he becomes overthrown by her. Right there, we observe the weakness of him against her on the one hand. Also, it's an irony that how men surrenders themselves to love, the quality of love. Then Celia's words, "and get our jewels and our wealth together," highlights the careful plan that she's making, such a careful plan to flee from the court and to settle down in the forest, because they need that jewel there, right? And at the same time, the concern for jewels or wealth is again at the moment of escaping from somewhere, is a comic one, but it also highlights the careful plan she has made. Her confidence again, Celia's confidence in wooing Touchstone, also shows the skill of women in persuading men. Her words, her questions finally changed the mindset of Touchstone, and he decided to accompany them in the point. Right? Thus, we find Act 1, through its wit and humor and also irony, creates the comedy. Thus, the play basically uses wit, humor, and irony for the purpose of comedy. Let's see what happens in Act 2. In Act second, Scene 1, the scene starts with the contentful words of Duke Senior, who expresses his happiness over staying in the forest. We see that invites or it initiates a debate between the country life and the court life also. His opening dialogue in scene 1 at the forest of Arden, in the setting, the forest of Arden, now my co-mates and brothers in exile. He says, are not these woods more free from peril than the envious court? See, here he initiates a debate that the woods, the forest is more peaceful than that of the disturbing, envious court. Because at the court he has been, he was, he found that envy, or the quality of envy in his brother, being envy in his brother, and he was also dethroned there, right? Therefore, he recalls that and says a contrast is brought between the country and the court. But we see at the end, somewhere he also says there are challenges, there are difficulties. He says the seasons difference, the icy fang, and the churlish chiding of winter's wind. These are the adversities or difficulties. But he concludes, sweet are the uses of adversity. He says, sweet are the uses of adversities. Actually, the difficulty in life or the hardships of life also bring sweetness or happiness. That is expressed in the words of Duke Senior. We also observe, as against Duke Senior's opinion, we find Jacques condemning or he opposes the life at the woods. What is again a comic thing here is this: Jacques initiates his debates or his contention, opposition to the price of the country life, and who supports, Jacques supports the court life. But throughout the play, it is Jacques who enjoys the country life very much. At the end of the story, also, he's the one who stick to the country life. I mean, to the forest of Arden. All other characters leave the place. Here again, we also find that in both of them, or including Duke Senior, what is there with us, we don't realize the value of that. Here we find a kind of longing for what is not with us. This is irony here. Through this irony, Shakespeare presents comedy here. As I already told you, it is irony that operates here also. And he highlights what absence we have in life that makes us realize that. For example, here Duke Senior has lost. Um, he's gifted with that court riches and all that. Once upon a time he was with that, and he experienced it. Still he doesn't know the value of it. But when he entered the forest, he finds the forest as the best one. But there are hardships and difficulties in the forest. Thus anyway, the play, this scene sets the debate for the discussion of forest or the country life versus the city life or the court life. Yes, when move on to the next scene, we find Rosalind is also in love with Orlando here. Her love increases towards Orlando, but her physical act of moving away from the court into the forest of Arden gradually moves away her from her love. There, the scene, the action in the play, in this part of the play, is itself is a paradoxical, because we find Rosalind's love increases, but in parallel to that, she moves away from it. She certainly doesn't know Orlando is moving to the forest, but we see that is the irony of life, irony of situation. Again, you observe Touchstone's recount of his past love and the break of his sword as a rival to prove his pure love is a pure comic scene in the play. He recounts his past story, how he loved someone and how he had to break his sword in the fight as a rival to prove his pure love. Right? He broke a sword as a rival, considering the sword as a rival. Like that, the story revolves around his past story. That's a comic scene. Here again, we are introduced to Sylvia's love-stricken condition, who is a pastoral. He's a shepherd who represents pastoral love, who is in his conversation with Amiens expresses his deep love. I'm sorry, in his conversation with um, Jacques, right? Jacques, he expresses his utmost deep love towards deep love towards Phoebe. Yeah, he with Rosalind he says, "Oh, thou didst then never love so heartily." So he says in that sentence that he ends that line with, "Oh, Phoebe, Phoebe, Phoebe." You see, he's love stricken. His extreme or exaggerated passion for love can indicate a parody of romantic notions made in the play. We also see such kind of parody of romantic love in the later history in 20th century too. For example, in Edmund Rostan's play, The Romancers, he makes a parody of romantic love presented in Romeo and Juliet of Shakespeare. Thus, we find parody is present here also. Shakespeare makes parody of that romantic love in this context. Jacques' idea of thanking as the encounter of two dog apes criticizes the pretensions in mannerism. You also see here, Jacques says that we should thank you. That, well, then, if ever I thank any man, I'll thank you. But they call compliment is like an encounter, like the encounter of two dog apes. And when a man thanks me heartily, me thanks, I have given him a penny, and he renders me the beggarly thanks. So here you observe, he criticizes that pretensions in mannerism, the mere artificial exchanging of thank and all that. Thus, artificial mannerisms in the language usage is criticized through Jacques here, but the description makes it funny. So then, his last dialogue in scene number 7, his important dialogue in scene number 7, that is very catchy. He opens with, a fool, I met a fool in the forest, a motley fool, a miserable world. As I do live by food, I met a fool who laid him down, basked him in the sun. But at the end, what he wishes is, he wishes to be a fool, right? Because for being a fool, or to become a fool, or if he is a fool, he is free to criticize the world. Therefore, he wishes to be a fool, to question the concept of fool around the world. Here again, Shakespeare uses his wit. The very concept of fool itself is wit, because a fool is used as a critique of the foolishness across the globe, around the globe. Therefore, around the world, right? ಎಲ್ಲೆಲ್ಲಿ foolishness ಇದೆ ಅದು. Therefore, we notice touchstone here, the very concept of touchstone here is a kind of role of a fool who criticizes the foolishness around. That's a wise creation in reality by Shakespeare. Those Shakespeare's fools are different from that of the worldly fools, therefore. And Jacques here wishes to be a fool than to be a wise man, because a fool can criticize the foolishness of the world, but a wise man cannot do that in his opinion. Thus, this also creates comedy in the scene number 7 of second act. In Act 3, it opens with a scene of Duke Frederick's court, where He puts eggs on his own feet by attacking Oliver for hating his brother. He considers Oliver as villain, he considers him as wicked, but in reality, it's a witty usage again, or it's a kind of irony here again, because a villain calling Oliver as villain, because he's encouraging that villainy in him, and now he calls him as villain in the context. Thus, we find uh, Duke Frederick ironically calls Oliver as villain, forgetting that he is a villain. Lack of introspection on the part of Duke Frederick is seen here and is questioned here. So, therefore, we observe Shakespeare tries to show the situational, he mocks it or he laughs at that situational irony where Duke Frederick, more villain thou well push him out of doors, and let my officers of such a nature make an extent upon his house and lands. Do this expediently and turn him going. So the wickedness in Duke Frederick goes to the height here, to the extent of condemning even Oliver. Then Oliver was sent to forest to bring Orlando. So here again we move again to the forest of Arden. There the pastoral love scene is presented once again, where Corin and Touchstone's conversation, they bring in them to meet Sylvius. So there presents the scene. The scene presents further the pastoral love sickness of Sylvius in particular, and also we observe romantic love of Orlando, who hangs his poems on the trees. But a very practical notion is there from Touchstone, who says who realistically condemns that Orlando is spoiling the trees by pasting those poems. We observe here that two different attitude towards love. Rosalind's poems express his romantic love, whereas Touchstone's contemptuous words on that express his practical or realistic concept of love. Another interesting thing where comedy takes place here is Orlando's love poems are imitated by Touchstone in a very parody. He makes a parody of from Orlando's love, and in his poems he makes a very attack on the romantic love poems of Orlando. His creation with I'll rhyme you so 8 years together, he says so. We see in one line example, for a taste, if a heart do lack a hand, let him seek out Rosalind. If the cat will after kind, so be sure will Rosalind. Winter garments must be lined, so must slender Rosalind. They that reap must sheaf and blind, then to cart with Rosalind sweet. So when these lines are parodied, whose lines, that is Orlando's lines, are in parody by Touchstone, Rosalind gets angry and she says, "Peace, you dull fool! I found them on a tree." Right? She says so. Here you observe Rosalind representing, or Orlando representing, that romantic love, and Touchstone representing practical love. In their presentation of ideas and their sentences, Shakespeare, through its irony and wit, creates comedy. Thus, the play becomes a complete comedy with the examples of comic expressions used in wit. Again, Touchstone's incident of wooing Adri, right? That is another example. There he tries to use high weight, but it is out of reach of a simple country maid Adri, country goat herd Adri. She doesn't understand anything, whatever Touchstone presents with his high court language. Then the contrast is again continues here, that is realistic in the romantic love. Again, and in another context, when Orlando appears, Ganymede, Rosalind has disguised as Ganymede, offers a love cure for him. She understands Orlando's love sickness and she is helpless to identify herself as Rosalind and express her love directly. Therefore, she finds an indirect method of using love cure as Ganymede. Here we find a kind of artificial act of curing one's love by substituting herself, a role of Ganymede, to Rosalind. Here, Shakespeare again makes a mockery at the gender relationships and all that. So Phoebe treats Sylvius with utter disdain. Come not me. So you see, that is another incident. Sylvius goes on approaching her to get his love, her love, so win her. Phoebe, on the other hand, expresses utter disdain, not even allow Sylvius to come to her near. This, in a way, Shakespeare is trying to project that supremacy of women in pastoral law, that women used to decide the things then. So that is probably highlighted here. Thus, the comic situations in the play are the result of the Shakespeare's wit and irony of situations. The well structured plot and perfect characterization and brilliant poetry in all these three acts, Act 1 to 3, prove the comic genius of Shakespeare, and the various comic situations presented in the play through wit and humor and irony are contributing to the they contribute to the perfection of the play as a comedy. Thank you for watching.